Welcome to the Noon at Northside podcast with your host, Pastor Stephanie. Well, welcome back, everybody. I'm super excited that you guys can join us again this month. I was really encouraged by what a lot of people said after last or 2 weeks ago's episode. So thank you so much for listening in on that. I think this is one of those topics where if we're in the business of bridging gaps, which is what this whole podcast is about, then this is one of those topics that we just have to talk about. We just have to sit down and say, here's the deal. Here's what it is we believe, why we believe it, and go from there. So with that being said, I'm really excited that we're going to be finishing off this month with some awesome guests. Our guests this week are filling in, actually, for our other special guest who is unable to make it this month. But that is okay because our two guests are Pastor Tim and Pastor Dallas, who are both pastors alongside me here at Northside. So I'm super excited that they're going to be sharing an article that they found. And they'll go into a little bit more detail about, what this article is, who wrote it, why they found it. But it's just going to be a nice experience for you guys to hear another perspective other than my own. And also another perspective other than somebody who works here at Northside, since they're going to be using an article that someone else wrote. So I'm really excited to basically just let you guys hear what they have to say. And I'm going to hand the mic over to them.
Hello, this is Pastor Tim Sheets from Elkhart Northside Church of the Nazarene.
And I'm Pastor Dallas Tharp, also from Elkhart Northside Church of the Nazarene.
Greetings. We are here to continue a conversation that Pastor Stephanie started last week. And we are going to be sharing to you an article that was written by Laurie Krieg. And it's from the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. And it's a really interesting title, and I think also has some really good talking points too as well. But it's called 10 Things I Wish Every Christian Leader Knew About Gay Teens in Their Church. And just to kind of introduce who Laurie is. She talks about growing up as a gay teen and some of the struggle that she had with that. And, as she did kind of come to terms with who she was and who she, could be in Christ and the good news of the gospel, she learned one of the things I think is repeated in her points is that, we are all broken, but we are also all loved. And she says in here in the introduction that, you are broken, you are beloved, but so is everyone. You can live in the tension with hope. And just to kind of set this up, she kind of looked back and says that if she could go, if she could maybe ask, her high school self, to address the church. She kind of had brought up a couple questions that she, kind of led to this article. But she said, what do you wish your church knew about you? This is high school Laurie. And what do you wish they would do for you? And so that's kind of where these 10 things come from. Anything to add to that, Dallas, before we jump in and start sharing these?
Yeah, and I think I just want to just kind of preface this because you may, if you're listening to this, you may ask yourself, why are two married pastors, not married to each other, obviously, but why are these two married pastors, having a voice or an authority to feel like we can speak about this? And we're not trying to approach this from a standpoint of, we're the ultimate authority on this and that we know better than everybody else. We're two people who are in the midst of this with students from our community, with people that we love around us, and we're trying to best represent Christ to the world around us. And so we're not coming at this, like I said, from a we're expert standpoint. We are coming at this from, we are asking a lot of these same questions of how do we best represent Christ to the world around us, especially to the LGBTQ plus community. And we just want to try to bring some things to the conversation of some people who are been in that community, who actively work with that community, and as pastors in our community, trying to do better about how we interact with our community around us. And so we're going to share some of Laurie's thoughts, what's in her pastoral perspectives paper, her thoughts here. And we're going to kind of add a couple of our own thoughts in here as we have seen ourselves kind of interacting with this and what we hope for the future of the church.
Yeah, thank you, Dallas. So here we go. We'll start. Again, this is written by Laurie Krieg. It's called 10 Things I Wish Every Christian Leader Knew About Gay Teens in Their Church. The first one is the statement, I have no idea who I am. And at the core is kind of that identity, that search for identity. In some ways, too, she points out it's a developmental issue as well because, our brains are still growing and it takes a while to kind of figure out, who we are. She says she wishes she would have been taught back then how to get to know, her real self. Felt that God was calling her, forth, but just didn't know how to answer him. And so she, with this point, it said, she wished she would have had some tools to use to bring the real me before a real God in a real world. And so, a question that I thought about as I was reading this is, how can the church help, with those that are searching for their identity? And just aren't sure, especially adolescents, and those that are growing and their brains are developing, how can we as a church help those that are, on that journey? Because we all are on that journey. And so that was number one, was the statement, I have no idea who I am.
Yeah, I think, and that's really important because that's a question I think all of us are asking, but especially those that are teenagers, those that are in the LGBTQ plus community, really trying to figure out who they are, dealing with all these things. And again, developmentally, there's so many things that are there and there's so many influences.
Yeah.
And so I think that really leads into her second point. Her second point is I need a gospel-centered identity. Because I think that's one of the things, I think this is true for all of us, right? Like we get so lost sometimes in what society and things are happening around us, celebrities, like all of these influences that are in our lives. And sometimes we just don't even know who we are. And so coming back to who truly are we with a gospel-centered identity. And it's not one that's, based out of shame or these different things, but the truth of our identity should be based upon God's grace.
Yeah.
Because no matter where we fall in this spectrum, if we're somebody that is struggling or asking questions or trying to figure out who we are, identity, sexuality-wise, whatever, we truly would like to know who Jesus actually says that we are, not just, oh, well, this was one pastor's interpretation, or this person all my life told me that this is what the Bible said. And really, I think all of us just need more of God's grace in our lives. And I think that's really where she's approaching it from.
Yeah.
Would really like to see grace as a higher emphasis that we extend.
Yeah. And she did mention in that, too, about, the spiritual disciplines come into play. Just saying that, she wanted to know how to listen to God, which, listening to God is definitely a spiritual discipline. She wanted to know how to fast, how to celebrate, how to meditate on the Word. And, all of those things fall under, that category of spiritual disciplines, which I believe can be a means of grace, too, as well, and help us draw closer to the Lord. And she mentioned at the end of this point, that she says, I wasn't a failure, I was loved. But my achievement and works-based identity was failing me. And so that might kind of segue then into point 3 here is, and that is that I am a prodigal too. And just to kind of read her first line here, just to kind of understand where she's coming from with that. It says, because I was such a good kid, people assumed nothing painful or messy could be hiding behind my smiling face and shiny blonde hair. And I did think it was kind of interesting. She points out that, the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15 is a story about this son that, gets his inheritance early and then squanders it away. But there's also the older brother who, is in some ways a prodigal too as well. He refuses, when the father accepts that younger son back, his older brother kind of refuses to come in and, be a part of that celebration and welcoming back. He has his own issues. And her point was that, for those of us that are parents that have kids that are good, we still need to have those in-depth conversations with them. She refers to it as these heart-to-heart talks, with kids to kind of find out, where are you? What are you thinking? Just having those talks and not just saying, hey, somebody's, my kid does good things, I can trust them. It's kind of like a saying I heard recently that I think my sister had shared this, that, he says that you have parents, you have kids, some kids that, or you might have one kid at home that you can trust to run the entire house while you're gone. They'll do the dishes, they'll clean up. If a disaster happens, they'd know exactly what to do. But you might have another kid that you couldn't trust with an umbrella. And, just everybody's different. And, I think we need to not be afraid of those differences and still ask, how are you doing with the Lord? What are you thinking these days? And not just assume that, because a kid's doing what we say or ask them to do that, they're okay.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest things that working with teenagers, I see this all the time, is our kids have gotten really good about putting on these false faces of allowing everybody else to think that they're okay and really hiding pain and suffering and hurt that's underneath. And again, as adults, we do the same thing, but it's crazy to see how much our teenagers have adapted this. And even into younger kids, they're adapting this into their way that they interact with people. So I think, she makes a great point of, asking every kid, what we perceive as the good kids and the bad kids, that how's your heart, how are you actually doing, what's going on, and allowing space to be real.
Yeah, good behavior doesn't equate to a good relationship with the Lord.
Yeah.
So just being mindful, I think, of that.
Yeah, I think there's a great thing that she writes in another article of hers. Because she talks about like this relationship currency. So being able to earn that relationship currency and being able to spend that relational currency. And again, that's developed from these relationships by us spending time with each other and asking that opportunity to build a relationship so that we have that space to be more vulnerable with each other.
Yeah.
So. And in being vulnerable with each other, I think that also means that we need to, as Laurie points out here in her fourth point, I need room to be messy. So, what does that mean? Like that doesn't just mean like, just come in and throw your stuff everywhere. But it does mean that we need to allow people to be able to not have their lives together. Like we don't need to expect any person at any point when they're asking questions, when they're dealing with stuff. Like we should never, especially as the church, we should never come in and be like, okay, well, like, make sure you get all this stuff cleaned up and then we can deal with these other things. Like there's a lot where like people just need to be loved and we need to love people and we need people to love
mess.
in their mess, and we need people to love us in our mess.
Yeah. We want to make sure that we're not kind of, unintentionally, by our behavior, I guess, setting up a standard where, people just feel like they never measure up to. Or feeling like, you have to kind of clean yourself up before coming to Jesus. Jesus met people right in their mess. And
I think one of her biggest points, especially with dealing with like teenagers in this, is allowing like how you react and interact with somebody who comes and trusts you with their say you have a kid who's coming to a point of coming out. How we react in that moment says a lot. Because if a kid comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm gay," and they're asking like a silent question mark at the end of that. They're asking, is this thing, and is this true? Is this right? Like, and because they're again coming back to this identity question. And so how we as church leaders, how we as parents, how we as followers of Christ react to that question says a lot of how we allow these kids to live into these things that they're asking questions about.
Yeah, I think it's really important. She, points out that if our kids if our child were to come to us and say, this is how I feel, I'm attracted, to the same sex, like we as parents should not, tell them, no, you're not attracted, to the same sex, because she, points out that, we're basically telling them that, that's not how you feel. And, it just never seems to work out in a relationship when somebody comes to us and expresses how they feel to us, and we tell them, no, that's not how you feel. We don't really get that right to do that, as a parent.
And that's the biggest thing, again, and specifically for us as the Church of the Nazarene, one of the things that we definitely affirm is that the attraction, so how somebody feels, is not sinful, right? So your orientation, your feelings are not sinful things. Like God has given us feelings, and that is something to fully affirm in people of how they feel. It's no less than we would with a heterosexual child or adult. Like we would affirm their feelings of how they feel about somebody all the same. However, it's what you do with those feelings then can be causational for other things that need to be addressed. But that's the same thing with all of us.
Yeah. And I also think too, and she points this out, that, if our kids come to us and confess and open up to us about their sexuality, and we tell them, no, you don't feel like that, like that's going to push them away. And we've kind of seen situations where the way parents respond, and telling in anything. I mean, if somebody's angry at somebody and they express it to them, and that person says, no, you don't really feel like you're angry, like that just, to me, it kind of hinders a healthy relationship. It kind of gets in the way and blocks that. So number 5 here, I thought was really, really good. I thought it was a practical, these are really practical things. Number 5 is, if I come out to you, here is how you can respond. And I thought these were just really good resources and, things that I think in a church that, need to be taught. I'll just kind of go through. I thought I would just read these so that we could just kind of have these tools. But so again, number 5, if I come out to you, here is how you can respond. And she's got several bullet points under this. One is to thank the child sincerely. And then she has, this is something that you could say, thank you so much for trusting me with what you shared. That must have been really difficult to do. And I feel like that right there is something that parents, grandparents, that we should practice that response. Just being really honest about myself and where I'm at. If, my kid came out to me, it'd be really hard to respond with that. I think I would want to naturally just kind of say, no, wait a minute. I don't know if I'd necessarily want to thank them and, acknowledge that, that had to be really difficult, for you to share. But I think that opens the doors, though, for, a continued healthy relationship with your child if you do that. The other thing was she had mentioned reaffirming your care and love. And she says, you could say, I don't see you any differently. I love you the same as I did 5 minutes ago. Just thinking how important that is, especially as we get a little bit more into this, some of the statistics of, those that, are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, some of the suicide rates among those individuals. And just thinking how important it is to know that, they're loved and loved unconditionally. Another thing here was she said, don't say, I thought so, or even I never guessed it. She says that makes the child feel like they are either a walking stereotype or a minority of a minority. And she says by a minority of a minority, I mean they may think I don't look gay, but I am gay. Then another bullet point was ask if it's okay for you to ask some questions. One of those questions could be, can I ask you more about your experience? And then also saying, feel free to not answer anything that you don't want to. I think these are good because as a parent, I think we sometimes just feel like we have a right to do and ask, at least I do sometimes, whatever we want and not really respect our kids. And so I thought this was really good just to set those boundaries and, again, just very respectful, loving. Another question was I really would love to know what it has been like for you wrestling through all of this. Another question was, would you mind telling me what words you use to describe yourself. Where are you at in this process? How would you like to be addressed? She says, if you're in a panic about what to say, restate what they just said. And you kind of gives an example. It sounds like you are saying, and then just trying to kind of, say what they just told you, which, some of us parents probably would find ourselves in shock and maybe not necessarily know how to calmly, be, reply. And again, so I just think these are really good tools to be able to use if we find ourselves in this situation. And even as pastors, especially you as a youth pastor talking with students, like these are just really good things that you can have in your tool belt. She said you can ask what their support system is like. With whom have you shared? What has it been like for you? Asking the child how they feel about themselves. You're listening for signs of self-hatred and potential self-harm. Safety is the highest priority based on statistics of LGBTQ teen suicide and harm. After all of this is a question, how do you feel about yourself? And then asking the child how you can support them. I'd love to come alongside you any way I can. How can I support you in this season? And then, do it. Make sure you do that. Two more things, and this one's done, but she says, reaffirm your love and care. Say, just to reiterate, I love you so much. I am with you. And then, she said, hug them, but ask, if it'd be okay if I were to give you a hug.
Yeah, and I think, again, these are great points because, one, they affirm people's feelings, identities, questions. We're not belittling people, saying that, you don't feel this way, or you don't, or you can't feel this way. Because again, like these are real emotions, these are real feelings of real people who are created in the image of God. And I think even outside the LGBTQ plus community, like these are helpful things for us to be able to process, of not just downplaying people's emotions or their feelings about how they just process different things. But I think giving, again, safe spaces and safe places for people to figure out these things. Saying, because none of these things are saying, like, let me teach you about, what Jesus said, or let me teach you about what's wrong in your life. These are just things that are just affirming people as people.
Yeah.
And I think that's the first place, again, that we have to come back to is allowing people to just be in those moments. Allowing people to just even grieve what they thought, like, again, talking about like how a parent would respond to this. Being able to process through some of these things with a person who comes out to you, like, allows you to be able to kind of grieve even like what maybe you had hoped for your own kids. And be able to begin to process, okay, so what does the future look like? And asking some of these questions, because again, I was just listening to another conference that was talking about LGBT stuff, and one of the things that they said is, let me be 100% clear, or positive, or I forget how they phrased it. They said, let me be 100% certain to you, you cannot preach Jesus to a dead kid, to a dead person. And so, again, first and foremost, like, these kids, these teens, adults, whoever they are amongst the LGBTQ plus community, dealing with different emotions, dealing with different processes, feeling rejected. If they feel vulnerable, like, that's where we see these rates of suicide, depression, all these things kind of rising. And so first and foremost, giving identity to people, and then bringing that back again to that gospel-centered identity, affirming that they are not wrong in terms of how they feel. Their attraction, if they feel like they're in the wrong gender, if they feel all these things that, society is playing back and forth on what is right or how do we feel, and what the church has responded to over the years, and how people don't feel validated. Because just because we're validating them as people and their feelings doesn't mean we validate every action that they choose to participate in.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with, asking questions, especially, when it's something that we are, may stand in really strong disagreement with, which may be, we may find ourselves disagreeing strongly on something with our kids. I think what can help the situation is to ask questions.
Yeah.
And these are some great questions to ask about this.
Absolutely. Because again, it comes back to that, what is that relational investment that we have? Because again, if we're not willing to ask questions and truly sit and listen, we can't have a conversation if we're just always trying to be the louder voice, trying to say, well, I'm the authority, or I'm the voice, I'm the one in charge, and your thing is not valid.
Yeah.
So,
all right, so I'll just recap, Dallas, while we're about halfway through.
Yep.
And again, this article is by Laurie Krieg, and it's called 10 Things I Wish Every Christian Leader Knew About Gay Teens in Their Church. Number 1 was I have no idea who I am. Number 2 was I need a gospel-centered identity. Number 3 was I am a prodigal too. Number 4 was I need room to be messy. And number 5 was if I come out to you, here is how you can respond.
And then that leads us to number 6 that says, know that in places of pain, you can speak Jesus to me. Again, this is not, I'm going to take my Bible and beat you over the head with the gospel, but this is how do we as the church, how do we as people truly represent Jesus? And again, that's by being vulnerable. That's by being allowed to be in spaces that ask these questions and allow us to interact with our students and our kids and adults around us.
Yeah.
Because again, people put up these walls, and our job is to be able to build a relationship in such a way that we represent Christ, that these walls can come down, that students, adults can feel like they can be more vulnerable with us. They can talk about where their pain is, instead of just trying to hide it behind these walls.
Yeah. Yeah, so number 7 was I still need to hear wisdom concerning a biblical theology of sexuality. I think sometimes, just we can get so wrapped up in just one side of things that we forget, the whole big picture.
Yeah.
That, there is, there's also a conversation to be had about, heterosexual behavior, what's right, what's wrong. And many times I feel like the church turns a blind eye to some of the things going on there, whether it's a couple that lives together, a couple that's not married that's having sex or has multiple partners. Those things are problems too.
Yeah.
So just hearing like a biblical theology of sexuality, that, hey, God made us. This is how he made us. He designed this. This was a part of his plan. She made an interesting kind of observation that, if we're not willing to kind of challenge people and try to speak truth and theology to them, that she kind of mentioned that, it's she was going to pick the easy theology or the easiest theology that she could find and go with it, which, to me might be that idea of, I'm looking for a theology that agrees with what I believe, or where I stand, and, just kind of going with that. And I think that's where we get a chance as a church to kind of challenge people and try to move them forward in a healthy direction and get them to really think about, what does the Bible say? What does Jesus actually teach?
Yeah, and that's one of the things, like, as I've worked with students, as I've talked with parents and other people, like, we talk about this spectrum of like where churches fall, right? Like, you have fully affirming churches who are just like, people can be whoever they are, do whatever they want, and God loves them. And then you've got the other extreme of like, God just hates everything that is opposition. And it's really easy to find yourself on one of those two sides of, it's really just easy to just love everybody and just, let God sort them out in the end. And it's really easy to just hate everybody and let God sort them out in the end. Yeah. It's really messy to be right there in the middle of like, what actually is Jesus saying? Mm-hmm. How do we actually interact with people who are, again, made in the image of God?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and she mentions in here that we don't slide into holiness. Mm-hmm. We slide into sinfulness, and kind of that idea that if you holiness, living a Christ-like life, living like Jesus did. Like if you want to do that, it's just not accidentally going to happen.
Yeah.
You're not going to just stumble into that. You have to, there's you have to have the vision for it, the intention, the means, all of that if you want to live a Christ-like life. And she's saying, we need to be taught that by our pastors, not just youth pastors, but, our senior pastors, our lead pastors, our worship pastors, our children's pastors, the whole church.
Yeah. Yeah, she says at the end of that point, love me and people like me enough to preach with empathy and compassion, because again, not Bible beating over the head, the truth about sexuality. And again, that's the whole spectrum of sexuality.
Yeah.
What does God actually want from us? How do we actually honor God with our sexuality, with our bodies, with the choices that we make? Point number 8, she says, I need protection. And this is just getting to the nitty gritty of this is that
amazing stats here. Heartbreaking stats here.
LGBTQ teens are 2 to 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-sexual minority teens, and are 4 to 8 times more likely to attempt suicide in highly rejecting families. That is just, to me, I'm sure to Tim as well, these are just heartbreaking statistics that we have these kids who think it's better for them to just end their lives than to be able to process what's going on around them. And that's because families that have rejected them or bullying that they're facing, or just not feeling like they're right. And it's just very difficult. And so we as the church need to be that forefront of how do we protect the vulnerable. That's exactly what we've been mandated to do. To be the voice for the vulnerable. And a lot of times as the church, especially to the LGBTQ plus community, we have abdicated that responsibility. And that's why we see so much of this hurt and brokenness.
And, we talked about at the beginning, this podcast, what kind of gives us the right, two pastors that, are heterosexual, married, with kids, what gives us the right to talk about something that we don't really, maybe can't empathize directly with, but, we can empathize with, broken sexuality, because, sexuality is, so much more than just, what we're talking about here, like the LGBTQ type of things. Like there's so much more to it. And we've all experienced the brokenness, whether it was things that we learned growing up. Like, for me, it just seemed like, the way the things I read, movies I watched, there was a lot of objectification of women. Like women are objects to be used. And, just didn't even realize, that was such that played such a big factor into my own thinking and growth about, how I look at and, how I looked at and viewed women. God has worked a change there. I want to be clear about that. But, there is some brokenness. So we all can, I think, identify, to that and empathize with that brokenness in sexuality.
And the other side of that then is the compassion, because the parts that we can't directly identify with, if we've never been any parts of that LGBTQ plus side of it, we're not going to be able to empathize as directly because that hasn't been our story. However, we can have compassion because we can understand what somebody's going through, and we can say, I may never feel exactly the same way that you do, but I can understand that there is pain that you are going through, that there's suffering. It's the same way that we as pastors, when we deal with people who are facing death or cancer or anything that's kind of happening, we can't necessarily always empathize in the exact of like, hey, I know exactly how you feel. But we can have that compassion to say, look, I understand you're going through stuff that I've never gone through, but I can be here for you. I can walk alongside of you. I can be a support to you through this, and it's whatever ways that I can.
And she gave some practical tips too, of just how to provide protection. Things that pastors can say and just remind their people of. Some of these I thought were just some great just kind of get me thinking about, how I address the church and things that we could say. One of the things that she had mentioned here was leaders, saying from the platform, that everyone in this room is loved uniquely and individually. We want to care well for all of you. Your physical, emotional, and spiritual safety is our top priority. We do not tolerate bullying, unkindness, or rudeness towards anyone based on race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation. If we hear about it or see it happening online or in person, we will take it very seriously. Yeah. It was just kind of offered as something, that, a leader could say that, could kind of just say that this space is, we want to protect you.
Yeah. And just trying to correct some of our bad theology of our language as well. Making sure that we are saying things that are accurate to those communities, making sure that we are not saying things that don't really represent or invalidate people as people. So like the phrase, you've probably heard it before, love the sinner, hate the sin. Yeah. Well, again, if you're saying being gay or identifying as anything in the LGBT community is a sin, well, now you're saying that you're hating that person. Yeah. And I think that that's just such a, not a great representation of who God has called us to be. Because again, God doesn't interact with us in how he sees us as our sin, because all sin is equal to God. And again, you go into this spectrum of people who don't even have a relationship with God, like talking about sin in their lives. Like we have to first introduce them to Jesus and let Jesus and the Holy Spirit do the convicting of sin in their lives, and not us being like, well, let me tell you about all of your sins. And because we don't do that with people outside of the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah, and she mentions, the example of Jesus and the woman at the well. And I think there are other examples too that we could probably think of just how Jesus interacts with people, and the ways that he does that. And she kind of closes that by saying, focus on instilling a gospel-centered identity. Speak what is true with tenderness, and let Jesus sanctify them. So number 9 on here was, I need a mentor, and then in parentheses, or 5. And this is no secret, but, there's a lot of young people that have walked away from the church. Yeah. The statistics mentioned here are 40 to 50% of kids connected to a youth group in high school will drop out in college. 59% of millennials have stopped attending church completely. So what is the solution? Well, one of the things that she just makes mention of here that she's seen as helpful is, students, kids, our teens having, different relationships, having different, connections, mentoring, with adults in the church, adults that are, great examples, that are Christ-like examples. And she mentioned, 5 significant adult relationships, per child, which, may sound like a lot, but, it's there's plenty of opportunity. I see there's plenty of people that could mentor people even here at our church. Yeah. And a lot do. I do want to mention that a lot do. But there's many more that I think maybe need to step up, and kind of be that mentor, and step into that, and that does help, with this this idea of I need a mentor.
And again that's the biggest thing, because our kids, they're looking for voices to be leaders of them. As much as, you might think it's a strong-willed kid or, this independent kid, they're still looking for people to influence them. And so they're going to find those voices. And so we as the church, we can't abdicate that responsibility of making sure that we're helping to be some of those voices that are, again, representing a Christ-like life for these kids and other people.
Yeah. So last one, point 10.
Yeah, remove heteronormativity. Normativity. I'm having trouble speaking today. So that's the assumption that everyone is only attracted to the opposite sex, and that remove that whenever possible. So, we've a lot of times, especially as like church camps and things like that, we've talked about, make sure that the boys and the girls aren't sneaking off together. And it's like, no, like we need to just use more generic language of again, we want people to be honoring God with themselves and their decisions. So I think just these ideas of not trying to stereotype, just thinking, oh, well, people are only attracted to this or that, and like recognizing that there is a much bigger world going on around us, and we have to deal with these things. But there is a Christ-like way to talk about how we deal with feelings and orientations and kids that are all over the place, and even adults.
Yeah.
So
the conclusion to this, and I really appreciate what she says in conclusion, is that, we may not get this right all the time. I certainly haven't, and we will make mistakes, but she does mention about how important, humility is. She says, humility is the most incredible, approachable, attractive characteristic of Jesus, and it can transform our relationships with each other. And so, I think there's, I just feel like kind of a call as a leader, as a Christian leader, to humble ourselves, and that means that if somebody that's a part of the LGBT community, is addressing us, talking to us, maybe telling us, hey, you use this term, and we don't use that anymore, or that's not what it means. Here's what it means. We need to be willing to listen.
Yeah.
And just because you listen to somebody doesn't mean you agree with where they stand, but you want to make sure that you're able to at least have a conversation, and when you're using a word, that you both understand what that word means.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think that's, again, getting everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
And being able to have a conversation. Because if we're just saying, say if I said the word bass, right?
Yeah.
We need to clarify, are we talking
about the first bass?
Are we talking about
second bass?
Yeah. Are we talking about a guitar? Or am I just really mispronouncing a fish?
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that we're saying the things that we know we're talking about the same things and being on the same page. Because, again, we can't build these relationships, we can't be on the same page if we're not willing to have these conversations to make sure that we are using the same kind of language that we understand.
Yeah, and she says that, humility is unquestionably the reason I stayed in the church, even while I lived a secret double life. The churches I attended and the people in them were imperfect, but they were humble. I just think of, again, how important, humility is in this. And, we're all learning, and that's kind of, again, why we're doing this, is that we are trying to continue to learn about this topic, realizing, too, that we don't know it all. And we're trying to learn from others. And so just staying humble, I think, makes you, willing to, to be teachable and to learn.
Yeah. And I loved her final statement here. I am more sinful than I believe, and I am more loved than I can imagine, and so are you. And I think that that's just a great reminder for all of us. We all have things in our lives that continue to allow us to be separated from God, and we have to be willing to address those things, but also recognize that even in those things that would separate us from God, like, God is love.
Yeah.
And I think that's the conversation at the end of the day needs to come back to an understanding of what love really looks like. And we, as leaders in the church, as people in the church, we need to so embody that love that it transforms the world around us.
Yeah. And that sounds like a good note to end on, too. So
yeah. We'll turn it back over to Pastor Stephanie, and she'll close us out. And thanks again. Leave questions, comments if you think there's something we need to converse more about.
Yep. The article, again, was by Laurie Krieg, and it was called 10 Things I Wish Every Christian Leader Knew About Gay Teens in Their Church. Thanks for listening.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Pastor Tim, Pastor Dallas. That was incredible to listen to. That was just a phenomenal article, in my opinion. And if you get the chance, maybe you can look up the same article and read it for yourself. I would check out some of her own work. I believe she has her own podcast that you can listen to. The other person who I would recommend listening to is someone who represents, the Church of the Nazarene on this topic, which is Anderson McGee. He was supposed to be our special guest today. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here. But I would definitely check out some more of his stuff. But you know what? It's so incredible to listen to, what Pastor Tim and Pastor Dallas had to say. Because at the end of the day, Our job as disciples, whether you're a pastor or you're not a pastor, whether you're a dedicated Christian or just a new person starting out in the church, our job as disciples is to build relationships with other people and to, from that, disciple them. In any mission, in any field where you're crossing cultural divides, the first thing they tell you is that you can't reach them without building a relationship first. It doesn't work without building that foundation of a relationship. And the same goes when it comes to dealing with the topic of the LGBTQ community. Our job as Christians is to love them, to build a relationship with them, and then to share with them the news of Jesus. And if they accept who Jesus is and they accept all that he represents, God will bring about sanctification in their lives. God will bring about the transformation in them. That's on him. That's his grace to bestow upon them. And for us, it's about just loving them and showing them what grace looks like. I'm really glad you guys got to come and listen to us this week. With that, I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll catch you guys next month with a new topic that'll go away from this one, but it'll be a brand new topic on how we can still build bridges and cross cultural divides. Until then, see you later.